um, I was given Antonio and Sebastian from Twelfth Night. And in case you're unfamiliar with these characters, we meet them in the second act, about 45 minutes in. Sebastian's a young man. He's possibly a teenager of noble birth. And he's been in a shipwreck and been rescued by a sea captain, Antonio. We discover later that these two have spent the next 3 months together and not been out of each other's company for so much as a minute. So Antonio might well be surprised when the person who gave his name as Rodrigo suddenly turns round and tells them that he's actually called Sebastian. And they end up in Illyria, that's probably now Croatia, and Antonio tells Sebastian that he has previous with the Duke of that area, and it's dangerous to be seen out and about. And Sebastian says, do not then walk too open. And that kind of resonated me, this do not quite walk too open. Don't be careful, don't show yourself, don't be too obvious. The actor I was working with is younger than me, but he's old enough to have lived through times when he's had to take that advice to heart. So I was seeking out stories, I have sought out stories from people who've lived through times when they had to conceal who they were for their own safety. It was illegal and sometimes fatal for them to even exist. Some of the information came from the British Library's archives, and the plan was that Andrew would lip sync their words from the recorded voices, and some came from friends who were telling their own stories. So again, Andrew was going to lip sync their words. When, if the play was actually developed, we would have Sebastian and Andrew, and Antonio, but the moment it would just be Andrew. So the British Library collection includes the words of James Pratt and John Smith and Candler, Arden and Doughty. And these were people who were all executed under the Buggery Act, which had first come into law in 1533. And there's a lot of information there about their execution. And for the last three, I found a song that was written to celebrate their deaths. And I'd sourced hurdy-gurdy music to accompany it. It seemed to be very important that I have music around it. I know a lot of people have provided music as far as the scratch nights are concerned. And I find hurdy-gurdy to be quite a mournful sound, but it can also be quite uplifting. And it sort of speaks back to the aesthetic of the Elizabethan age without actually being entirely of it. So the voices, the stories that people were telling me, there was one friend of mine, Will, and he was telling me of losing his virginity to a barman and then going to the bar later and finding out, meeting this man again and being so excited about seeing him again, and then finding that he was having to blank him, that he was so terrified. And Andrew said, I had never seen anybody so terrified. So we've got to think in terms of what happened in the early part and what happens in the later part. Alongside this was the plan to play the same scene from versions of Twelfth Night, showing the different ways Antonio and Sebastian had been directed. And that came from a 1970 version, which has really excised everything about love and connection. And the Lindsay Posner version, which was an RSC version, I think, in 2001, when Sebastian and Antonio were first seen getting dressed on an unmade bed. And I think you'll find that many of the versions from the colleges in the southern states of America are worth a look. In case this sounds a little bit heavy, I just want to read you one of the stories from the British Library collection. The places to go in those days were very thin on the ground, but there was a shake-up bar at the Regent Palace Hotel. That was one of them. I was in the shake-up bar, which was men only allowed in the bar, and I was sitting at the bar on a high stool, and I became aware of the amount of officers who were standing around, including 2 officers from my own battalion, which was in Portsmouth Army Catering Corps. And I was aware that all the officers there were homosexual, and it gave me a tremendous lift to realise that other ranks were queer the same as I was. And on the following Monday, when I got back to the battalion and I was marching across the square, one of these young officers was coming towards me and we saluted each other. And as he passed me, he said, You'd have a nice weekend, dear. Keep it to yourself. And that sort of gave me strength. Not that I needed any kind of moral boost, but it was very gratifying to know that officers were also inclined to be my way as anyone else was. And I decided I'd had enough anyway. So I went to the medical officer and I came out on medical grounds. On homosexual grounds is the more truth. I told him that I was a homosexual. And of course, if you admitted to be homosexual in those days, you were automatically released from the army. We called it taking the veil. So I took the veil quite early. So that would be the picture of what we're going to present. It is this mixture of personal experience. It's the idea of being able to source some of the actual words of people who were put in great peril during the 1900s, the 1800s and the 1900s, and also think in terms of how Antonio himself changed throughout that period, how he was held back in some places and released in other places.